of the things that being in the class as far back as you and I are, Billy, is have to use reading glasses.
Oh, trifocals, and they're new and they're really eating me up tonight.
I'll just call your attention that there is a poster board here, some props that have to do with the things that I'm going to be talking to you about tonight. You can glance at that from time to time if I say something that seems to suggest that, or look at it later, or ignore it, you know, just whatever. I'm going to start off by saying that on 3 really historic days in August of the year 1925, 411 years ago, a relatively recent A&M graduate who was then an Aggie athletic trainer named Carl T. Sprague stepped up to a studio microphone at the Victor Talking Machine Company in Camden, New Jersey. He recorded 10 songs that day that he had learned on cattle drives in Texas. It would not be very long before one of the songs, When the Work's All Done This Fall. Some of you are shaking your heads, you know the song. That would actually, about a cowboy who was killed in a night stampede. And that song would muscle its way into the top tier of American recorded music, become a nationwide hit. The Aggie singer would establish what you and I now regard as the quintessential songs of the singing cowboy. According to the best estimates available, that song, that fragile 78 RPM scratchy record, sold very close to 1 million. Well over 900,000 copies. They didn't keep real good records in those days. Carl had learned When the Work's All Done This Fall, and many other cowboy songs from, he was working with an uncle named Lige, Uncle Lige he called him, and he learned all these songs from him because he was the guy who ran the cattle drives. But at Aggieland, Carl had a band and a musical show on the campus radio station. And he often sang the old cowboy songs. And when he traveled to Camden, New Jersey, that was a long way from Aggieland, he made history at on that particular day. Very few, if any, record companies anywhere in the world at that time had any idea of the vast number of cowboy songs that were out there in the public domain. Carl's uncle was named Joseph Elijah Booth, and it was from him that Carl learned the songs and the poems that had been passed down from the cowboys for many, many years, generation after generation. Eventually, when Carl was old enough to work on the cattle trails himself, he once said, my uncle and I used to sit around the fire at night and sing those old cowboy songs that cowboys had been singing forever. And we'd make camp right there on the prairie, and there wasn't anything around us but cattle and horses and stars and us, as he put it. So when Carl arrived in College Station to study agriculture, A&M wasn't that much older than Carl. Carl likely went to work to pay his way through college, just like I did and like a lot of Aggies did. Maybe some of you did the same thing. He dropped out of A&M for a while for a 2-year enlistment in the Army for a war that you and I know as WW1. And he came back to A&M in 1920 and graduated in the class of 1922 with a degree in AH, animal husbandry. For a while, Carl was a left-handed baseball pitcher for the Aggies, and he became a trainer for the football team. Worked for a legendary football coach, Dana X. Biden, whose 1913 Aggies were, say it with me, unbeaten, untied, and unscored. That was the correct answer to a campusology question that was very popular when I was best known as Fish Boyd. And what set Carl apart from other cowboy singers of the day was that Carl had lived the part, dressed the part, wearing those Western clothes, especially the cowboy hat, in his publicity photos and his public appearances. That was the very first widespread use of cowboy image by any singing performer. This was way before the coming of moving picture singing cowboys like Gene Autry, Tex Ritter, Roy Rogers. And you can bet that when they came along, that their attire was patterned after Carl T. Spragg. He was the first to use that image to market his recordings of traditional cowboy songs. At Carl's second recording session in 1926, he had musical accompanied by two Aggie buddies. One guy was named Charles Dockham, and the other one was named Harold McKenzie. They both played the fiddle. Carl played guitar. His later recording sessions, Savannah, Georgia, 1927, Dallas, Texas, 1929, were his last until 43 years later, when during the revival of folk music, you remember in the 60s and the early 70s how much there was going on in the folk music field. Well, that Carl was brought out of retirement involuntarily. He recorded 2 long play albums for the Bear Family label, which was a German label, and they recorded this one and another one pretty similar to it at College Station. The label came to Carl this time. And another one, the Victor Company, released some of his old 1920s recordings on this album. And in other words, he began to be famous again, all over again. And of course, they wanted Carl, all of them wanted Carl to sing, and by then he was an old man, just like me and Billy. But they wanted him to sing that very special song that at one time made him temporarily famous, When the Work's All Done This Fall. About that time, at the age of 46, Carl went back on active duty in the Army. Worked as an Army recruiter for a while in Houston and Dallas. This was, of course, sometime after WW2, but it was in the 60s and the 70s that he had his second career of being somewhat famous, some sort of a cultural celebrity in those 2 decades. He traveled to the University of Illinois and to places, universities in California that at that time were meccas for folk music singers. And when he died, though, in 1979, his history-making music achievements had sadly been somewhat forgotten. At the Bryan College Station paper, for instance, the headline was, "Baptist Deacon Died Wednesday." Now, in the story, though, there was a passing mention of his musical career, that he was a cowboy ballad singer, and that he had made some records for Victor, but that was one line. No mention at all of his massive cultural influence and mega-selling song, When the Work's All Done This Fall. Dennis Williams. That name may ring a bell with some of you. He was a radio personality and a music promoter in Bryan in the 2000 to 2005 era. And during that period, he came to admire Carl's legacy. And he actually tried, without a whole lot of success, to get the community, the Bryan College Station community, to honor Carl with an annual music festival and a museum. But Dennis Williams was able to convince the German folk music label, Bear Family, to come to College Station and to record The Old Man once again on compact disc. And by the way, this is the compact disc of all the recorded songs that he did in the 20s. And it's available. Just go on Amazon and Google for Carl T. Spragg. It's an amazing historical record with some great historical notes on it. So, I'd say the legacy and the spirit of these recordings will be with us always, thanks to the Bear family for reissuing them. And certainly the spirit of Carl T. Sprague will always be with me. When I enrolled at Aggie Land in 1953, I had no idea that my life would be so heavily influenced by a man I'd never met. It's a story that's filled with so much coincidence, if you believe in coincidence, that eventually I had to write it, first for myself, and then publish it for a wider readership. But that was not as easy as it sounds, even though I'm a journalist and have spent my entire adult life and a lot of my childhood doing nothing but writing. It took me 16 years, from 1981 to 1997, to write this story, which was published in April of '97. This is the little story, the one-page story like that in Farm Journal magazine. The story was not difficult conceptually. It wasn't difficult structurally. It was difficult emotionally because I had to get ready to write it emotionally. The story is about one of the best friends that I or Carl T. Sprague, either one, ever had. And the title of the story, A Man to Ride the River With. That'll ring a bell with some of you who have some kind of cowboy lineage in your history. The story was written as a column, which I had at the time at Farm Journal, and it won some recognition in a national writing contest. The judge said something like, "I don't know why I like this story. All it does is celebrate a life, but I do like it," he said. The story actually would go like this. His name was Forrest W. Cooper, Jr. But in the Waco fashion of college kids in the 50s, we just called him Cooper. We didn't call him Coop. That was the name that had been co-opted by Gary Cooper. And nobody wanted to try to up the big man from the West, Gary Cooper, the best known for his High Noon movie and as well as many others. But just like Cook, Forrest Cooper, class of '57, Texas A&M, was a real man of the West, and his word was his bond. To borrow another Western motif, Cooper would do to ride the river with. Now, what that means in cowboy lingo is that only a chosen few could ever get that kind of compliment. It means that he was a man who could be counted on to risk his life for you. Now, I was supposed to have met Cooper in 1952 when we were both teenagers in FFA. I was on an FFA visit to Ypsilanti High School, that's near El Paso in far western Texas. And at the time, Cooper was the FFA president there. His father, Forrest Sr., was the FFA advisor and the VOAG teacher. Remember, he had been one of the best friends of Carl T. Sprague at Texas A&M. Well, as it turned out, he was 2 years behind. Forrest Sr. was 2 years behind Carl T. Sprague, but they became close friends at A&M. And they later became farming partners after they graduated. Cooper Jr., though, my Cooper, my Aggie buddy, grew up considering Doc Sprague. Carl T. Sprague was known as Doc Sprague when he was a trainer at the football team at Texas A&M. I think all the trainers get to be known as Doc. Now, he never had any kids of his own, and Cooper, my Cooper, considered Doc Sprague family, like an uncle, like he thought he was almost like he was his father's brother. But Cooper, my Cooper, was out of town during the time that I visited Ypsilanti in the fall of 1952. So I met Cooper only when the two of us were at A&M. And we both students there, but in the same military outfit, A Battery, Field Artillery. And Cooper and I became part of an Aggie threesome. The third musketeer was Johnny Cates. Johnny Cates, like myself, came from East Texas, Gilman, and had only dreamed of being a cowboy. Whereas Cates, Cooper, and Boyd used time off when we didn't have to be studying or some other kind of Aggie duty. We strummed a mail-order guitar that I kept in my closet of my dorm at Texas A&M, and I suspect Carl T. Sprague probably did something very similar with his guitar when he was there. We would sing some of those same old songs that Carl T. Sprague had made famous and had recorded when he too was an Aggie. So Cates, Cooper, and Boyd would occasionally swap tales of the tall type, but Cooper's cowboy stories were always from real life. Cooper was a real cowboy, and he had been just as much of a real cowboy as Carl T. Sprague was. One time, Cooper told Boyd and Cates about partnering with some other teenagers in high school in West Texas and going out on the rodeo circuit. And they were going to share not only what they won, but what their expenses were. Well, I asked, in all my East Texas innocence, what would happen if Cooper had a few bad days and maybe didn't win anything for a while. Well, a wave of disappointed disbelief swept over Cooper's face, and he looked at me, paused for a long minute, and he said, "Friend, you don't ride with people like that." It was the first of many lessons in humility and lessons in friendship, lessons in trust that I would learn from Cooper. During college and later when we were together in the Army at Fort Sill, Cooper stood up for me in times when a lot of people wouldn't, when it would have been safer for Cooper not to have said anything. But neither a cowboy nor an Aggie would do that, which is another way of saying that Cooper would not do that. An example. At A&M, A Battery Field Artillery, all the sophomores, and that included at that time Boyd, Cates, and Cooper, we were on a forced night run, being punished for the juniors in the class. I don't know, some kind of Aggie-related offense. I remember what it was, but if you want to know, talk to me afterward. Or it could have been just for good bill. You know, that would have been a good enough reason for the juniors to do it. It was tough, though. They kept us on the march at a very fast pace on a night with no moonlight. And Cooper, who was much more athletic than Boyd, occasionally slowed his pace back so that he could keep an eye on me and make sure that I didn't fall out, pass out, or lose out. Well, after graduation and time in the Army together, Cooper and I lost touch for a while. But we linked up again when I found him as a farm journal editor farming in Arizona. For a while, Cooper raised pheasants on a farm in Florence, Arizona, where customers would pay him to hunt the game, the pheasants on his place, and then they would pay him to dress them and have them ready when he left and that sort of thing. Later, he concentrated on extra long staple cotton in Yuma County, Alabama, or Arizona. And while he was there, Cooper phoned me for help in arranging a fateful trip to Texas. He and two farmer friends, Don Anderson and Jeff Alder, all three farming in the Yuma County area in extra long staple cotton, Pima cotton, you may know it as that. They had decided that they would pioneer peanuts in Arizona, which wasn't growing any peanuts at that time. And their idea was to sell the crop on the world market, not in the United States. Arizona had no peanut acreage allotments at all at that time. And their crop would have to depend on whatever the world market would pay. No U.S. farm subsidies at all. something I don't think anyone else at that time had ever thought of. It was truly a bold idea, and I don't think anyone else had ever tried it or even thought about it seriously. Cooper and most cowboy types, I think a lot like that. In other words, entrepreneurially. They think of opportunities. Once after the three of us, Cooper, Boyd, and Cates, had graduated, Cooper tried to persuade Cates, who was a poultry science major from Gilmer. He tried to get Cates to move to Arizona to be a business partner with him in a business that involved chickens or birds or something, some kind of fowl. And Cates, in his East Texas innocence, looked at Cooper and he said, "Where would the money come from?" And a wave of disappointed disbelief came over Cooper's face. And he looked at Cates for a very long minute. And he said, "Friend, out here in the West, you don't need money. You just need a good idea." And Cooper had a really good idea about growing those peanuts in Arizona on the world market. At least he and his two farmer friends believed in it, and I believed in it well enough to set up the tour for them in Texas to learn how to do this, because I just knew it was going to be one of the best stories that I had ever done for Farm Journal. So at Cooper's request, I planned the itinerary for the trip for all four of us. The tour, the week-long tour of growers, scientists, processors, everybody connected with peanuts in the Erath County area, which was then the capital of the peanuts independent industry in Texas. Cooper and I were roommates during that week tour, and I was certain that it would be a basis for a major story in the magazine. I took lots of notes, made lots of pictures. Cooper and his two neighbors were all three licensed pilots. All three of them had their own plane, but they came to Texas in Anderson, Don Anderson's big Cessna Centurion. He had the biggest plane of all of them, a four-seater. There were only three of them in it, but there were four seats, a big four-seater, the Cessna Centurion. Some of you are familiar with. Really a great plane in many respects. So when the tour was over, on the return trip, we had breakfast together in Stephenville, and Anderson prepared to take off from Stephenville into what I saw as really heavy, dank, dark, dangerous cloud cover. To me, as a non-pilot, the skies really looked angry. And I asked Don, in my East Texas innocence, "Are you really going to take off in weather like this?" Well, yes, he was, because he was sure that visibility would be fine once they got above the clouds. And still, when Cooper was the last aboard, and he paused just in front of the door to get into the Cessna for me to have that final photo opportunity of Cooper stepping inside the door, opening the door and stepping inside, I focused the camera, taking a little bit more time than usual. And Cooper, who I knew to be a very, very cautious pilot, looked at me and he said, "Boyd, if we never meet again, goodbye." They had one more stop to make. Seminole, Texas, which was another big peanut area in Texas at that time. Gaines County, that is. I had arranged for them to stop and visit with J.O. Jackson, a guy who had combined cotton and peanuts very, very satisfactorily. It was exactly what the Arizona farmers wanted to do, Cooper, Anderson, and Alder. The difference was that Jackson had a peanut allotment, and he could count on a support payment for his, and he knew he would make a profit. A profit was assured because of that. As it turned out, heading towards Seminole was in the opposite direction of my home in Plano, so I didn't go with them on that final leg of the trip. They took off from Stephenville in the plane, and I got in my car and drove back to Plano. And when I got to Plano, there was a message waiting for me. Phone message from J.O. Jackson. The news was not good. The plane had gone down in heavy fog. No survivors. But in a certain way, there was. One of my pictures from that trip shows Cooper, firm-jawed, silently solemn, in that sunshade and cowboy hat garb that he always wore, back with the blue skies and fleecy white clouds, looking for all the world as if he hankers to take one more ride into that surreal sunset that will forever, in my mind, be 1981. As the last to see them alive, I was interviewed by the National Transportation Safety Board, which concluded the cause of the crash was spatial disorientation. That means not knowing which way is up and which way is down. Cooper's wife, Frances, also told me later that Don Anderson's big Cessna plane didn't have a working artificial horizon when they left Arizona. For some reason, didn't get it fixed in time for the trip. And if you're a pilot, you know what that means. Also learned that none of the three farmer pilots, they were all licensed to fly, but none of them, not a one of the three, were instrument rated. They all flew visually. Today, as it has for the past 35 years, the picture that you see up here on the head table, picture of Cooper, rests, other than when I have it out like this on the road, so to speak, it rests over my computer screen, my writing desk, where I focus my eyes and my memory, my attention for inspiration. Cooper is still the man I look to when things get tough. I've been told that the death of Cooper changed me in ways. My wife told me that it changed me. It may be that I continue to celebrate his life simply because I admired him a lot. Always thought Cooper led an exemplary life, as exemplary as anyone I ever knew. That his time on earth may have been cut short, may also be part of the reason that I keep him in my thoughts and prayers. Maybe to validate the importance of his life, however short it was. After all, we can view Cooper's life today in at least two ways: purpose and promise. Dealing with the early death of a close friend like Cooper seems to have become a somewhat easier thing for me to do since I discovered a small, little-known book by a well-known author, Harold Kushner. Some of you know him as the author of a bestseller called When Bad Things Happen to Good People, but that's not the book that I found that helps me deal with this tragedy. This is a little book called Living a Life That Matters, subtitled Resolving the Conflict Between Conscience and Success.